Hi guys, my name's Adam and this is the very first video here on this channel. In this video I would like to look back at this iPhone 6 and see how it holds up almost 6 years after being released back in 2014 and if it's reasonable to buy this model even today. So let's take a look. Like I said, the iPhone 6 was released in September 2014 and it was a very big change for Apple in terms of design because it was the first time they used screen larger than 4 inches in their smartphone. 6 came with 4.7-inch Retina LCD panel and its body was made from glass on the front and aluminum on the side and back of the phone. The phone feels really good in a hand even today and the design doesn't look that outdated, at least considering it's 6 years old phone. Of course, there are huge bezels around the screen, for today's standard at least, but that was to be expected because it was a thing back in the day. I think the design definitely stood the test of time and if you use this phone today, you don't have to be embarrassed about its design. The aluminum body of the 6 was subject of big controversies back in the day, and you probably still remember the infamous bend gate. Apple reacted to this problem and they made the aluminum much stronger in their newer smartphones, but I really didn't have any problems with bending during the time of using this phone. As I said, the screen is 4.7-inch LCD panel and it does look really nice even today in 2020. It lacks a few features of its successors such as pressure sensitivity, aka 3D touch, P3 color gamut or True Tone, but for being 6 years old, it does look really nice. The screen has a good colors and contrast and it gets pretty bright in the sunlight. Of course, the new iPhones are miles better, but again, it needs to be repeated that this phone is pushing its 6th year. Although there's one thing about this panel I had a problem with. This particular phone had its screen replaced, but on the other iPhone 6 models, I saw that after a few years of usage, the screen sometimes has yellow corners. It's usually only visible on a light background, but I saw this problem on multiple iPhone models, most often on a 5S and 6. I haven't seen this issue on the iPhone 7 and newer yet, but it may be because screens of these models are not as old as the 5S or 6. But if your iPhone 7 or newer has this issue, write it in the comment section. I'm really curious to see if Apple fixed it in the newer models or not. Under the screen you can see that the iconic home button is still present, but it's the old mechanical one, not the haptic sensor one, which is present on the iPhone 7 and 8. In the home button, there's also a Touch ID fingerprint reader, but even though this is in fact the second iPhone with the fingerprint scanner, the actual sensor is the first generation optical one, same as it was on the iPhone 5S. That means it won't be as good as the newer iPhones, and sometimes you will have to scan your finger more than once for the unlock to proceed. Also, I had a problem with sweaty or wet hands, as well as dirty hands. In these cases, the scanner usually didn't work and I had to type in my passcode instead of using Touch ID. iPhone 6 came with a single 8-megapixel sensor, and the photos do look quite good, even after all these years. You don't have any of these new fancy camera features such as ultrawide or telephoto lenses, night mode, live photos and others. You don't even get an optical image stabilization, as this feature was only saved for the Plus model of this phone. That kind of sucks. But if you just need a point-and-shoot camera and you mostly take your pictures at daylight, then the iPhone 6 camera will not disappoint you. For the price that you can get this phone for today, it would be very hard for you to find a better camera in today's low-end smartphones. But unfortunately, that's not the case with the front-facing camera on this phone, as it simply sucks. Apple probably didn't notice that selfie was word of the year in 2013, and they probably didn't think that their users would want to take pictures of themselves with the front-facing camera, because there is almost no improvement in this camera compared to the iPhone 5 and 5S. It's low resolution, very grainy and absolutely unusable in low light. The only reasonable use case of this camera that I can think of is FaceTime calls. But at least Apple realized that the front-facing camera really sucks, and they heavily improved upon it in later models such as 6S and 7. And while we're talking about camera, we can't forget video. The rear camera can actually shoot 1080p video at 60 FPS, which is actually really impressive if you think about it. You can even shoot 240 FPS slow motion videos, and that makes the video shooting probably one of the best features of this aging smartphone. Performance is probably one of the weakest parts of the iPhone 6 in 2020. This phone came with Apple's custom 64-bit AA chip, which was pretty good at the time, but it was really a minor upgrade over the A7 in the iPhone 5S. But the chip isn't the main problem of this phone's performance. That would be the amount of RAM present in this device. It has only 1GB of RAM, which was low amount of RAM even back in 2014, as 2GB was standard back then even in mid-range devices. Of course, we can't compare Apple's devices with Android competition. It's known that iPhones don't need as much RAM as other smartphones. But in my opinion, the 1GB of RAM in iPhone 6 was really a bad decision. Apple probably didn't want to put more RAM in it simply to make next year's iPhone 6s seem like a monster powerhouse compared to the 6. So, with A8 and 1GB of RAM, how's the performance of the iPhone 6 in 2020? Well, it's not absolutely terrible, and its stock apps run quite fast on this device. The problem starts with third-party apps, which usually take a huge amount of time to load compared to newer models. But when the loading is over, the standard apps such as YouTube, Facebook or Instagram run just fine without any major stutters or freezes. But because of the 1GB of RAM, this phone can keep many apps running in the background. So if you plan to use it, be prepared for constant reloading. Gaming on the iPhone 6 is actually not as bad as I thought it would be. Of course, you won't be able to play the newest graphically intensive titles such as Fortnite or PUBG. But if you're a casual gamer of Angry Birds and Candy Crush Saga, you will be just fine with this phone. We all know that Apple has recently put a major focus on improving battery life on their iPhones, and the new iPhones such as XR or 11 and 11 Pro have one of the best battery lives across any smartphones. But back in the day, iPhones were notoriously known for having a pretty bad battery life, which was due to the fact that Apple focused more on making the phone slimmer and lighter than on the battery life. So what about the iPhone 6 battery life? This phone only has a ridiculously small 1810 mAh battery, and the battery life is not good. This particular model that I have here had its battery replaced a couple of months back, but the battery is actually faulty and it needs to be replaced again, as it only shows 19% of battery capacity in the settings, which is definitely the lowest number I've seen on the iPhone so far. But even if you manage to get an iPhone 6 with new battery in it, you probably won't be able to get through the day with this phone. iOS is really well optimized for preserving battery life when on a standby mode. But if you actually use the phone, the battery percentage on this model will go down like crazy right in front of your eyes. So keep that in mind, and if you're using this phone, bring your charger with you all the time, because it's very likely that you will need it often. This phone originally came with 16, 64 and 128GB storage option. But down the road, the 16GB was discontinued and Apple introduced the iPhone 6 with 32GB of internal storage. If you plan to buy the iPhone 6 today, I would definitely avoid the 16GB option, because for a serious use, it's almost unusable today. 16GB was a low amount of storage even in 2014, and Apple was heavily criticized for keeping it in their lineup, and they eventually bumped it up to 32GB in the iPhone 7. I personally had my 16GB iPhone 6 Plus since the day it was released, and even though it was a low amount of storage, you could get by with using it if you relied heavily on cloud services such as iCloud or Google Photos for storing your images and videos. But as the time went by, apps and games became larger and larger in size, and with every new version of iOS, the system also grew in size. So today, when you get your hands on a 16GB version of the iPhone 6, you will be only able to install few essential apps, take few photos, shoot some videos, and the phone will immediately alert you that you are running out of storage. That's probably why Apple discontinued the 16GB version, and you should avoid it too, unless you're a light user who uses mainly the stock apps and saves his images and videos to the cloud services. Then you can probably live with 16GB, at least for a while. Apple is known for its outstanding software support. They usually release the new version of iOS to their phones for at least 5 years, and the iPhone 6 was no exception. It came out with iOS 8 pre-installed, and through the years it received upgrade to iOS 9, 10, 11 and eventually 12. It was the last major version of iOS this phone received. With iOS 12, Apple really focused on improving the performance of the older iPhones. It was necessary after they messed it up and made the older iPhones almost unusable with iOS 11. Right now, this phone runs iOS 12.4.5. It is the latest version available. Apple won't update this phone with new features anymore, but they provide security updates when some dangerous bugs in the system are discovered. That was exactly the case with 12.4.5 a few days ago. But keep in mind that other than the security updates, this phone is no longer supported, and like I said, it won't receive any more feature updates. But don't worry, you are still able to install almost all of the apps from the App Store, because most developers still support the older iOS versions. There are only a handful of apps which require the newest iOS 13 to run. But unfortunately, that is example of some of Apple's own apps such as GarageBand, as the newest version of this app requires iOS 13 to install. But if you have purchased the unsupported apps in the past, you will be able to install the latest available version for your operating system right from the App Store. So app support is really good right now, but in the future more and more developers will require you to have the newer iOS version to run their apps. So I think this phone has about 1 or 2 years left in terms of being supported by third-party apps. So is it actually worth it to buy and use the iPhone 6 in 2020? Well, it depends. If you're really on a budget and you just need a simple smartphone for making phone calls, sending text messages and browsing the web, you will be just fine with this phone. But keep in mind that this phone is no longer supported by Apple, and even though it's not that big of a problem today, it's gonna get worse in the upcoming months and years. Performance of the iPhone 6 is also not the best, and the battery life simply sucks. If you can get it refurbished or used for a really good price, then probably go for it. But in my opinion, it's much better to save a little more money and buy the iPhone 6s. It's much faster thanks to a really powerful A9 CPU and 2 GB of RAM. And it's actually still supported by Apple, and you can run the latest and greatest version of iOS 13. But the iPhone 6 is definitely one of the most iconic products from Apple in the last decade. It was truly a revolution in the iPhone design language, and a clear shift from the Steve Jobs era original design of iPhone 4 and 5. But maybe it's time to say goodbye to this phone. It had a pretty good run.